Hello everyone. In this video I'm just going to basically introduce concepts for 3D rendering using architectural rendering software. So basically most of this presentation is going to be on materials and 3D materials. It's going to be a little bit on lighting, but again it's the basic root concept of how and why it works, not necessarily the specific steps to make it work. And for those of you who tuned in, there's obviously lots of videos I have on that kind of stuff. So this is more theory. And basically for a lot of this presentation, I'm going to be working with just this cube right now. It's a white cube. I have a shadow on it. The grass, that's just there to set it. I actually put that into Photoshop. Right now it doesn't matter that it's not there. It just, helps give it some presence on the page. It will become important later in the video though. So we have this model here, and what I've done here is I've just done this in SketchUp using this basic SketchUp material, and it's basically called texture mapping. And so there's this image, the way that when you go into SketchUp, or really, again, this is applicable not to just SketchUp. It's really applicable for any 3D rendering software, even Revit, which is different than many of these softwares. It all applies the same thing. And what they do is they start with the photograph, a raster image of a piece of material, which is why perspective images always come out as raster images, is because texture mapping, because this is a picture, it's a raster image, and they basically apply it to the block. And in this next slide here, if you're not exactly sure how it's done, it's meant to represent it. And basically what it does is it takes this little image and it does it multiple times over the whole block. So we can see this square here that I have in these dotted lines, that's one representation of this. And then next to it, they just put the same image again, and next to that, the same image again, and so on and so forth. And then downwards, same images below, so on and so forth, over on the left and on the top. So you just take this one small image, no matter what it is, and you tile it together. That's what it's called. You tile it together. Now, of course, what that means is the images that you're using here, they're very sort of special images. Because it means that this edge right here has to perfectly match that edge, so that when it's tiled together, you don't actually see the dotted line. So really good texture maps, you can't tell that the tile's there. Poor ones you can. I'm sure everyone has seen an image where they don't have a nice texture map and they can see the lines. The same is true top and bottom, right? That this line here matches the top of this edge perfect, so that you don't see the different lines here. Of course, here we're using siding, and it literally is the line of the siding edge here that I'm showing here, but the point being that it matches. You don't notice that it's another photograph. So it can take time to make your own texture maps. There's obviously lots of texture maps out on the internet that you can download if the software you have, which usually has many kinds of textures as well, that probably has a lot online. You can probably find other ones, just make sure they're tileable or whatever the case might be. And you can, and I have at times, I have made my own texture map as well, but it takes a lot of work and effort to make sure that the left and right and top and bottom do work together. That's not what this video is about. I don't have any videos on creating your own texture map, but there are others out there if you're really curious about it. I often find, all the resources out there, there's plenty to use. And then if I need to edit something a little bit in Photoshop, perfectly fine. Or quite honestly, if it's just a little piece of a building, let's say 98% of the building, I have all the textures I need, but maybe 2% of the project needs to be something different. You know what? You just go into Photoshop, you paste over top some materials in there and sort of using a collage type tools, and it's quicker and faster, and you don't have to worry about it all. Nonetheless, it is important to know sort of how the concept of these tiles work. And actually, this is the simple version. I think the more interesting stuff in this presentation is to come, where sometimes maybe you will make some edits here or there for particular reasons. So anyway, here's the texture map again. I want us to look closely at that. Now, did you see that? Let me go back. Let me go back the other way. So here's the basic SketchUp rendering, just a texture map. Many softwares besides texture maps have other ways of manipulating the texture itself to make it look more realistic. And the biggest one is bump map. So we can see this is bump map. Again, I'm going to do it one more time. There's SketchUp. There's the same material, but with a bump map. So what is a bump map? Essentially, a bump map is a thing that makes a flat surface look more three-dimensional. So we can see here the texture map's the same. That's the same thing. Usually bump maps are always grayscale, black to white, and mostly grays. And what it does is it overlays, just like it's tiling the texture map onto this object, the software is also tiling the bump map in the same spots, except the bump map is telling the model to use lighting techniques to make it look like it's three-dimensional to a certain degree, right? So so knowing that it's meant to give it more three-dimensional look, I'm going to do this one more time. There's without a texture map, it's flat. And there it is with the texture map. We can see it looks like the dark parts are in further and that these pieces are more overlapping each other, because siding really does have a three-dimensional feel. It's very minimal, and it would take a ton of time to actually model all siding so as at slight angles and overlapped each other. Could you model siding that way? Sure you could. It's going to take a long time. But the reality is you use a texture map and a bump map, and you can get that effect much more quickly. And it looks just as good that way. So texture maps can really take, because everything has really three dimensions. Nothing in life is perfectly smooth, right? And so if you give things texture maps, it looks really nice. Now, fortunately, some software comes with these things already preloaded into them. But many times they're not exactly what you want. Oftentimes they're not perfect. So I know, like in this class that I'm making this video for, we're basically going to use SketchUp, and then we're going to go use Enscape for rendering, and you'll have to make some adjustments to it. In fact, actually, the great thing about Enscape is I love Enscape because it's simplified. I like to think of it as the SketchUp version of rendering engines, because it's pretty easy to use. You don't have as much control that you might in some other programs, but super easy to make some quick bump maps. In the olden days, it took a little more time. It took Photoshop work. Obviously, what I could do here is I could take this into Photoshop and turn it grayscale and begin to use it, and that's what you had to do. But Enscape sort of has some of that stuff built in. We'll take a look at that in another video. But that's the concept here. And then I did something funky here just to get the point across. I put these white dots on the bump map and sort of rendered it. And you can see what clearly happens here is those dots sort of feel like dimples on it now, or even they're really sort of coming out towards the page. Because really the way that usually bump maps work, you can reverse them in a lot of software, but by default I'll just say basically pure black pushes it in to the image, into the field, the surface. White pushes it out as far as it'll go, and grayscale perfectly 50% gray keeps the surface exactly where you modeled it. Now, most rendering softwares allow you to toggle how far in and out it goes. There's always a limit. Obviously, you're not going to like extrude a skyscraper just by putting a flat plane down and giving it a bump map. Not only would that take more time than just actually building it, just the software can't do it. But you can like, do I just want a little bit of variation, or do I want a somewhat more variation? More is usually some sort of toggle or slider that you can do to adjust how far out or in does white or black go. So you can see how, could I have modeled all those round circles on the surface? Yeah, I could have. It would have taken me a long time when it only took me a few seconds to put in white dots in Photoshop and reload it back into the rendering. So bump maps are a great way to make things look more realistic. And I will show one building representation at the end of this presentation to show specifically what I mean. But what I want to show is that bump mapping is probably the most basic, and I think the one that enhances images the most after your texture maps. But there's actually several other kinds of mapping you can do in 3D modeling. Oh, I forgot this. I'm going to sort of jump back here for a second. This is still a texture map with a bump map, and I just want to remind people, because usually if you're making a texture map, it's really easy often, again, you change it to gray, even just changing it to grayscale is going to get you 50% of the way there for a bump map, maybe even more. But sometimes it can backfire, so I purposely use this black or dark gray brick, because I like, when I'm using brick, I like sort of dark gray over sort of a reds and browns color brick. But even this would be even true for those colors too. And the mortar is white, right, or light gray. And so if I turned this image is the real image that I use. That's the texture map. You can see it is grayscale, so I could use it for a bump map because it's already grayscale. The problem would be the joints are white. that would push out, and I want to push the joints in. So what I've had to do for here is I had to invert the image in Photoshop. I had to basically say make white black, black white, and then now that the joints are black, for traditional bump mapping, that would mean, oh, those get pushed in. And yeah, I'm sure very subtly over here you can see that. But again, great thing for brick and other stones and all these things to use a bump map to get the mortar joints to be pushed in a little bit, create little shadow lines there. Can really make the image look a lot more realistic than just not using bump maps at all. So we just have to think about it sometimes, like, oh, what should be black, what should be white, what does my grayscale need to be, if the software is not going to do it for you automatically. Or you have to tell the software to reverse it sometimes. So again, we'll see that when we go over the software specifically. As I mentioned, bump map is not the only kind of mapping. Many students, by this point in time, they're already familiar that 3D modeling can make materials transparent as well. And I have the same cube here. I just turned on the transparency somewhat. What you might not realize, though, is that transparencies can also be mapped. So by default, if you're just using a basic transparency tool in a 3D rendering, it's just taking the whole material and making it completely transparent, or to whatever percentage you have it set at. But really, you can do it to the same effect, where you say, where do you want to be transparent and how much? So for example, I just created this image, just to be silly, to sort of put it in your face, if you will. Transparency maps, like bump maps, are also always in a version of grayscale. Gray meaning, 50% actually transparent in this case. Black is pretty much 100% transparent. Usually it's sliding scale still, so like any setting, you can say, is black 100% or is it less than 100%? But it's going to be the thing that's most transparent in your image, and then white's going to be the thing that is least transparent in that image, depending on what you mean least. It might mean none. It might not be, depending on your settings. But it works the same way as bump map. So you can create anything here. This is sort of silly. You can see the result over here on the right, where there are the black squares here. You can see through. You can definitely see on this side pretty easily the black squares. You see right through to the other side, and you can see the white dots. You don't see through at all. They look really dark just because this is the shaded side, so you see the full version of the shade. It's sort of almost an optical illusion that's happening here on this image, because you see the full shadow as opposed to the rest of them. You sort of see through to the white box behind, so it sort of opens it up. And you can obviously see where the gray is in between. It's semi-transparent. So you get a little look here. I started telling you might be asking yourself, like, okay, well, that's fun and great. And but how would I use this in architecture specifically? I think the first thing to remember is a lot of these techniques are used beyond architecture. 3D rendering, cartoons, things like this. They use all these effects in many different ways. And if you're making an animation, especially too, you might not be able to post-process it in Photoshop. So you might need to use these things. But I have used something like this in architecture, both in practice and with students. I want to give you one example, because they're all very similar techniques, but one that I did with students a couple years ago. It was a group project, and the students they did this sort of, I'm trying to remember, it was a high-tech farming center, or education. I think it was an education building, high-tech sustainable farming. And they wanted to create these shade structures for some glass and rooftop garden that they had, or not garden, because they did have some gardens, but for where people would sort of occupy the building so they wouldn't get too hot. And they made them out of these metal panels, and they wanted to perforate these panels. And the panels, when you look from afar, the holes in the panels would create an image of like a leaf, this organic feel. And so there was like hundreds or thousands of little holes they needed in this material. So they'd get this sort of stipple effect that would reduce the lighting, and it sort of looked like a leaf. It was really, really well done. And they could have modeled all of that. They could have modeled thousands of holes, but it would have taken forever, and it would have even been hard to probably render and for them to do. But I said, hey, what you guys can do is draw it in AutoCAD, which is what they were sort of sketching it out in AutoCAD. They had a leaf that they were sort of tracing over and whatnot. You can put these holes in, then throw it into Photoshop. Just fill in the holes with black, using your paint bucket, and then use it as a material in your rendering. And so I think they started with SketchUp. I can't remember what they finalized software they finalized the rendering in. But I know it started in SketchUp at some point. That's where I helped them put in the transparency map, and so they only modeled a solid surface. But because they use a transparency map with these holes that look like a leaf, when it was rendered, it looked like there was little dots of light coming through in this leaf pattern, and it really worked. And so it's far simplified their work. It simplified the rendering time, and that's where you might use something like this, something like a sunscreen. Or I've used it before on like trellis work or like little piece siding, where there's little gaps or joints or things like that I want to be able to see through, or something like that. It's like, well, I don't want to model each little piece. I'm just going to use a transparency map on it. So there are definitely reasons to use this. And then on here, I sort of switched the cube to a pink cube for this. You're going to see why, because it has to do with other reflections and different lighting techniques. And so I wanted some color to it to be able to see what's going on. And again, I sort of did this to an extreme just for demonstration purposes. You would never set this high. But many pieces of software have something called image-based lighting. It might be called something else, depending on the software. But basically, in the setting, you can say, what is the lighting like in general around this thing? So I could have modeled all this grass. Like I didn't, and this is why I didn't. This is getting back to this grass back here. I could have modeled a plane, and I could have applied a grass texture to it, which, computers today are definitely much better at rendering grass than, say, the olden days, which would never look good and take forever to render. They can do it better now, so if I really want to do it, that's probably how I would do it. But the other way of doing is I could just do the Photoshop technique. The problem is the grass in all other images around really affect the lighting and the reflections of any object. And so if I just did this grass in Photoshop, the rendering wouldn't know that there was supposed to be grass under it, and it would change how it's supposed to look. And so there's a way of working around it. There's sort of an in-between state. That's what image-based lighting is. It basically says, give me a photograph of the place this thing is supposed to be, and it'll make the lighting and the reflections look like it's set in there. Now, is it as good as actually modeling them? No, not necessarily. And I'll get into some of those here in a slide or two. But it also is super quick and is better than not doing it at all. And so what I've done here is I basically told the setting I cranked the setting up. I said, how much impact do you want the image-based lighting to have? And I basically turned it all the way to the top. And so this is the pink cube. The thing is, because it has this yellowish green color in the photograph, here's the full photograph. Actually, it's the same photograph that's here. It's just the whole thing. And I just put it right in. I didn't even think about it, just dropped it in. But because there's so much yellowy green in there, and I cranked it all up, this grass, it's basically saying like, oh, this grass must be reflecting onto this, and it's creating, it's like absorbing that light. The light is changing the yellow green because it's so high. Normally you wouldn't have that high, set high, but you would have, at least at points of this cube, there would be some yellowish greenish tones on it because of the grass that's around it. And so that's what this does at a basic level. More importantly, or more interestingly, image-based lighting in these images can be used not just for lighting itself, which can help, but really more about reflections. So, of course, reflections do happen in architecture, primarily at windows, and I talk about windows all the time in various aspects. And we think of windows as being transparent and seeing through it. And that's generally true when you are inside the building, but if you're outside the building and it's daytime out, actually windows are quite reflective. And so there's lots of ways of handling this. If you modeled a tree next to your building three-dimensionally, or people, if you put people in your 3D model, your glass will reflect those images, and that's great, and that all helps to the realism. But you often aren't going to model everything around your building because it takes too long. There's no need to. And what using IBL, or image-based lighting, allows you to do, instead of modeling it, it'll just reflect that image. Just say, oh, it sort of like wraps it around the object itself, so it's almost like it's there. It just does it all in its sort of computer memory, if you will. And that's what I've done here. There's really no grass again here. This is just the cube. The model itself is just the cube. The grass was put into Photoshop, but what I did do is I used the same image for the IBL and turned on reflections. And so it reflects that grass. Even though that grass doesn't exist in the model, it's just being told to reflect grass. So that's a sort of a quick way of getting sort of a complexity in your reflections with just using 3D modeling. Again, I'm going to talk about this later on when we see the building, but I think there's an even better way than this, in my opinion. Nonetheless, just like bump map and just like transparency map, you can actually have a reflection map. And I won't spend too long in here because I can't say I've ever used a reflection map in project. Maybe someone could. It certainly could see it being used in some artistic sense, but same thing. Black is non-reflective, white is reflective, and gray usually has somewhere in between, depending on your settings. And so you can see, I can say, oh well, now I didn't model these little squares, but let's say only part of it should be reflective. I can just use a bump map for it, right? So I don't know, maybe there's something like you have metal panels and some of them are shinier than others. And so you could use a reflection map to say, oh, these ones are shiny and these ones aren't, perhaps something like that. I don't know. That's all I can come up with. I've never done it. Similarly, there's something very similar to reflection in some softwares. We're starting to get into some. They don't exist necessarily all around in all softwares. I don't even use them necessarily that often in architecture, but they do exist. So I figured I'd talk about them because they're the same basic concept. And there's something called shine, which is basically a lot like reflect. The only difference is they usually only reflects lights, not any objects. So, and again, because we'll see this in a moment when we talk about lighting, but there's lots of ways you can control lighting. And if you just want to have some bright spots or like something just really shining because there's light hitting it and you want to see that, that's how you would control this without making reflections, right? So like there's lots of different ways of doing this, but let's say like a metal surface, even though it technically would probably reflect a little bit. Realize you don't want to be like a mirror, but you want to like glow. You want to have that little spot of light on it. And you want to see that. That's where you would use something like shine. So you could model it, more often, rather than, even if your software has that option, I could probably do that effect in Photoshop faster. But I thought I'd mention it. Like these things do happen. As you can see here on the right, it also has a map, and I just threw it up really quick. I'm just using that same black, square thing, so you can see where I can control parts of it being shiny and parts of it not being shiny, right? So just through that. And again, I had to have the IBL on because I don't have any lights in this model. It is just all doing from this faux lighting from this image that I have. And then the same is true with roughness as well. Sort of, again, it might be one that you use, but for high-end modeling, again, a lot of these things aren't necessarily used for architecture, but you can imagine if you're doing cartoons or maybe you're an industrial designer and you're like really close onto a object that's on your desk and you're going to see all these little details, and the lighting is very, very important because it's so small and object focused as opposed to a big building that has complex site and sort of all these things to it. So roughness is just about how light is reflected, whether it's smooth or not smooth. And then, of course, you can bump map it the same way if you need to. Again, have I ever created a bump map for roughness? No, I never have. Not in architecture. Only for this presentation to sort of show how it works. But does it scatter the light on reflection so it becomes more of a diffuse light, or does it more mirror-like in its reflection? Is basically what roughness does. To quickly sort of summarize what it does there. And then again, here is the pink cube, and this is for demonstration purposes. What I want to say, if it wasn't obvious, all the mapping can be done together on one object. And again, I have something silly here, but it is just to show, again, do you necessarily use bump, reflection, transparency maps all on the same object in architecture? No, not necessarily. I mean, I can't say I have, but I have used bump maps and transparency maps together. In fact, the thing I was talking about, the sunshade that I was talking about, had a bump map. I didn't talk about it, but it had a bump map because most materials want a bump map if they're going to look good, but it also had the transparency map to let the lighting through. Right, so you might use two together. Same thing with reflection map. It might also have a bump map, and I'll show another example of that here on a slide coming up. But you can see the result here. I just, again, made different shapes so you could see them, and you can see there's a bump. This is just the pink cube, right? There's nothing here. It's got a high IBL still, but you can see it's got those little bumps of circles popping out. I can see all the way through, almost like a fence because of the transparency map. And then some of the surface is more reflective than others. It's a little hard to see because it's so chaotic in here. You can sort of see it on the side. We don't really see much in these squares, but you can see a reflection of the grass a bit in these other zones over here. But anyway, you can combine them all together. Even the ones I didn't show, you know, you shine. I could have added a shine map as well. I could have added a roughness map as well if I wanted to. But feel free to sort of combine them together, which makes sense because most everything will have a bump map in it. So if it's got anything else, you might get that as well. There we go. I said about shine. So here's an example of these things on an actual project, and I totally forgot. And I realized this when I was reviewing the presentation to make this video, but I had the IBL still up pretty high from all those images I was just making, right? So you can actually see the house is a bit greener or yellower than it probably should be, but that's okay. It sort of gets the points home that I have an IBL that's reflecting the green look here. But you know, in a building, this is basically the kinds of things you're going to have. You're going to have a texture map. Yes, you can see I've used it on siding in the brick. I had those earlier in the presentation. I actually have a bump map for the standing seam metal roof. Right, so actually, it's really, you can sort of see it's a little washed out up here on the top end. I think that has it applied. I think I applied it to that roof as well, but you can definitely see it on this roof edge. There's no standing seams in here. It's a flat plane, but it's just the bump map basically that's sort of giving it those shadow lines. Interestingly enough, I do have a shine on here as well. I could have used reflection for more simply. I had control with the software. Your software might not have the difference between those. But nonetheless, if it is shiny, right, if it's a metal roof, often does have some shine to it. So whether it's a little tiny bit of reflection or if it's a little bit of shine, either way, you can see how it sort of affects the lighting differently on there. That's sort of nice. Again, texture map on the bumping, on the siding. Of course, the windows have a reflection on them, but it's also reflecting the IBL because this is just a photograph background, and I wasn't going to model all these trees in there or the grass. That's also sort of all done in there as well. I will say this though. I find, and I have other videos on it, and we've practiced this in class, I often find that windows are just easiest to do in Photoshop if you're doing it still, because in Photoshop you can make a really nice reflection. I think it's quicker to do, and it looks better. You have more control over it. And also, you can also, if you wanted to, do some transparencies too, so you could quickly throw in what the room might look like on the inside, be very dark, but just get a little bit of texture of like, oh, I can see sort of through it. Also, I see the reflection of the trees that I put in here. So this case, I did not use those Photoshop things. The house itself is just a pure 3D model output. You can see what it does, this sort of exaggerated version of using all these bumps and shines and reflections. But even so, I really recommend, even though it sort of seems easy, oh, the computer knows what it's doing, all they need to do is set the things, it's going to look great, blah, blah, blah. No, still use Photoshop. I mean, usually what I'll do is I won't even worry about the windows that much because I will know I'm just going to basically do it all in Photoshop. It's good to sort of know those things. There are exceptions. Obviously, if you're making an animation or something like that, you're not going to be able to process it in Photoshop, so you're going to want to get the best that you can look in the 3D render itself. But if you're going for quick and good, Photoshop can often take the place of these. Just know what you're doing, know it all, and then you can choose what works best for you in the particular situation. Now I have a note down here on the bottom of the screen too. I haven't actually even applied bump mapping to everything here. I could have done it in window frames and concrete and some of the wood structure there. But I think also it's good to remember, like in architecture, again, this is not a huge house, and to get the whole thing in, I'm still standing fairly far away. So I'm far enough away that there's not a lot of detail in all those materials. The little bump map for the siding and the brick and the standing seam roof and all that stuff, that totally helps. But at a certain level, you have to say, well, is it going to take me more time to do this than I actually see in the image? I'm so far away, yeah, then maybe you don't put a bump map on something, and that's okay too. So just think about it, think what's best for you, and so on and so forth. Sort of switching gears here just for a couple minutes. The other important thing about rendering is that you can do lights. By default, most software starts with what's either called an infinity light or a sun. That's over there on the left. You usually have control where that is in the sky. But by infinity light, they're all doing the same thing. And it means there's some light source in the direction, and there's a bunch of light, and it's all parallel lines of how it's being reflected. That's why they call infinity, because the sun's not infinitely far away, but it's far enough away that geometrically, it's might as well model it that way. It saves so much memory time than to do it otherwise. So that's what it is. You move it around, it's like the sun. Usually only have one of those. I mean, there might be software you can add more than one infinity light. I'm not sure, but usually since it is representing the sun, you just get one. And then usually most software has at least two other kinds of lights. There might be more, but the most common ones are point light, which is basically you model it. You put an actual object in, usually some sort of things, like usually like a sphere or something. That's what this little white thing is right there. And what that is, it's not really an object. There's no real surface there, but it just emits light, because like these things work on ray tracing, which basically means light. It's calculating little light waves that go out an array and hits the surface, then gets reflected or absorbed and keeps going, and it does it around the drawing. If it is a bunch of reflections, it'll sort of follow the ray as it goes where it needs to go and do all these calculations. So here, that little sphere is putting light out in all directions, and the software is tracing it out where each individual piece of light, ray of light, would go and hitting it. So you put it in the center, and these spheres all sort of glow. You can see in the center, the infinity light is turned off, which would make like an evening rendering, right? So the back sides are dark, and it casts these shadows from that point. That's a point light. Reflects or sends light in all directions. Usually it has most software has something like a spotlight as well. Very much same concept as point light. Rays go out, traces it around, except for instead of going in all directions, spotlights usually control in what direction it goes to, like a spotlight does, right? So really a spotlight or a point light would be your regular light bulbs in a house. LED, hopefully, where the light goes in all directions, and a spotlight would be what they're called spotlights because they're modeled after spotlights that you maybe put specially used at like either in ceilings, like recessed lighting where the light goes straight down on the ground, or in exterior lighting where you might have something out in the site somewhere shine at the building itself, not anywhere else on the site. So in those conditions, you'd use a spotlight for it. And of course, in an evening rendering, and I don't know why I didn't put an evening rendering in this presentation. I probably should have, but in an evening rendering, you'd have multiple lights. You might turn off the sun, but you're going to have lots of point lights and lots of spotlights on. And you'll see that in the assignment that I'll give, because we'll walk through the step-by-steps of those. But you want to use multiple lights. And oftentimes I find if you're doing an evening rendering, a couple quick tips is, one is pure black. Night is not always the best of times for a couple reasons. First of all, it's just too dark, like sunset, sunrise, that gives a little more interest, is nice. But also it just makes it too dark to see the detail. And I think the thing with like lots of models is, even if you're in a rural setting, there's still lots of lights around the site. Could be the moon even, right? Cars, street lights, people's phones. There's lots of light in the environment, and you're not going to model all of those things probably in your 3D model. You could, but it's going to take time. So instead, what you end up doing is you have to put fake lights around your building just to make it have some sense of lighting, so things just don't get too dark. You're going to add more lights than you think, and just lights that don't even represent anything, just to light up the atmosphere, because there is a lot of light that reflects around the atmosphere in general. And so sometimes it helps, that process of setting not at the dark of night but in sunset or sunrise helps, because you'll have the sun as well very low on the horizon, be very dim, but that little bit of extra lighting sort of helps give you see all of the house, and then the point light and spotlights to really pull out details can work quite well with that. So, and then I think this is the last slide I have in this presentation. Just wanted to mention most software as well, 3D rendering software, doesn't just have lights like these invisible lights we were looking at on the last slide essentially, but you can actually turn objects or surfaces to emit light as well. So that's why I just went back to this cube thing that I've been working with, and I just said, hey, be a light emitter. Now I don't have anything around it, so we don't see it hitting any light, but you can definitely see that it is uh, glowing. I don't do this a lot, but I can see it be useful. So for example, let's say you have some cove lighting or something like that. And instead of putting a light source or a bunch of light all the way in the cove, you could just take the hidden surface that you'd never see and tell that surface to emit light. And it'd be like the easiest way and then of making that cove lighting glow. And so you'd always have that glowing edge, say around the top of your ceiling or whatever you're putting the lighting at. So that's another thing you can do there. You can see I'm not a super expert at lighting. So why don't you go ahead and become better at it than myself. So this was the introduction to 3D modeling of materials and lighting. Again, all the specific details of this will be in the assignment so you can follow along. But this gives you the reason of why we're doing things a certain way. So good luck and keep making your great drawings.